For nearly 30 years, Burt Reynolds called Sally Field the love of his life. He said it in interviews, in his memoir, right up until his final years. But Sally Field never answered him the way anyone expected. She stayed silent. She stayed away. And for decades, nobody understood why. Then she finally revealed something she'd buried since childhood. Something that explained the entire relationship in a way no one saw coming. The real story was never the romance the cameras captured. It was something far more painful and far more personal. To understand what Burt Reynolds meant to her in 1976, you have to understand what Hollywood had already done to Sally Field. She got famous young, and it worked against her. In 1965, she was the cheerful surfer girl Gidget. From 1967 to 1970, she played a flying nun on The Flying Nun. Both shows were hits, but they came at a cost. Casting directors stopped taking her seriously. She became the goofy sitcom girl, the actress nobody wanted for real roles. That rejection lasted years and was powerful enough to make her wonder if she'd ever break out of it. By her 20s, Hollywood had already decided she was finished, and she couldn't even get a meeting for the parts she actually wanted. Then, in 1976, everything changed with Sybil, where she played a woman with 16 personalities living with dissociative identity disorder. The performance was raw and impossible to ignore. She won an Emmy. Suddenly, people who'd never returned her calls were calling her directly. Burt Reynolds was one of them. And this detail matters, because Sally Field didn't meet him from a place of confidence. She'd just come out of years of professional silence, and she still needed proof that this new respect was real and would last. Into that fear stepped the most famous man in movies, offering attention, thrill, and validation. In her memoir, she described what Reynolds represented, not just to her, but to everyone. He was the fantasy. 1976, he was on the verge of becoming the biggest movie star on Earth, riding a run of massive hits with that effortless charm and swagger. And now he wanted her. Their connection exploded fast after meeting on the set of Smokey and the Bandit in 1977. She later told Diane Sawyer that after just 3 or 4 days, it felt like 4 years. Smokey and the Bandit became one of 1977's biggest films, trailing only Star Wars at the box office, and audiences fell in love with their on-screen chemistry. But underneath the dazzle, Sally Field could already feel the pattern that would define and eventually destroy the relationship. She later said it was never a simple romance. It was built around her caretaking and his need to be cared for. She was 30. He was 40, the biggest star on the planet, but the relationship was never equal. He was the strong man needing constant emotional support, and she became the one holding him up. Years later, she understood exactly why that role felt so familiar. She'd been trained for it since childhood. In her 2018 memoir, In Pieces, Field revealed that her stepfather, actor and stuntman Jock Mahoney, sexually and emotionally abused her as a child, abuse that continued through her teenage years until she turned 14. She explained that what made it so damaging wasn't cruelty alone. Mahoney could also be magnetic, charming, thrilling, a man who lit up any room he entered. That contradiction is exactly what makes this kind of abuse so effective. It teaches a child that warmth and pain come from the same source, that love has to be earned from the very person who hurts you. And Field later realized she'd repeated that exact pattern with Burt Reynolds. In her memoir, she wrote the line that changes everything. I had been carefully trained to fall into this. She wasn't just saying he reminded her of her stepfather. She was saying she'd been shaped by childhood abuse to be drawn toward exactly this kind of man. Charismatic, controlling, warm one moment and punishing the next. A man whose approval always felt precious because it never felt secure. Reynolds didn't create that pattern. He simply stepped into it, and by her own account, she was primed to mistake that fit for love. Once you understand that, the rest of the relationship reads completely differently. Field described in detail how he used his fame as a form of control. In her memoir, later quoted by Vanity Fair, she wrote that by the time they met, his stardom had become a tool for controlling everyone around him. And from the moment she walked through the door, it was a way to control her too. He showed little interest in her inner life, growing distant whenever she tried to talk about herself or her sons. His jealousy of other men left her afraid to even greet someone in public. She wrote that during Smokey and the Bandit. He was using Percodan, Valium, and barbiturates, a detail that lines up with what his second wife, Lonnie Anderson, later wrote about his drug use leading to physical abuse in her own marriage to him. Even their famous on-screen chemistry didn't feel romantic from the inside. Asked about kissing him on camera in a 2022 interview, Field's answer was blunt. It involved a lot of drooling. In the end, she summed up the entire relationship in one devastating line from her memoir. "We were a perfect match of flaws. Everything came to a head over a script." In 1979, Sally Field was offered the lead in Norma Ray, the story of a textile worker who becomes a union organizer, famous for the scene where she stands on a factory table, holding a handmade sign that simply says Union. Burt Reynolds didn't want her to take it. She later said he objected because the character had a sexual past in her backstory, calling her a whore for it, and then threw the script at her. That single moment says everything. A man reacting to a woman's growing independence like it was a personal attack. When she stood up to him, he told her, "Boy, you're letting this get the better of you." The language of a man watching his control slip and trying to frame her strength as instability. She took the role anyway, and doing it changed her at the deepest level. She later said that learning to stand in Norma's shoes taught her to feel her own legs, her own body getting stronger, and that she eventually just wouldn't be manipulated and humiliated like that anymore. And ultimately, she left. Norma Ray premiered at Cannes, where she won Best Actress and got a standing ovation. Reynolds hadn't even wanted her to go, and instead of celebrating with her, he asked, "You don't think you're going to win anything, do you?" Then came the 1980 Academy Awards. Sally Field was nominated for Best Actress. Reynolds refused to take her, repeating the exact same line. So actor David Steinberg and his wife took her instead, arriving with champagne, giving her the celebration she deserved. That night, Sally Field won her first Best Actress Oscar, without him there. 5 years later, she'd win her second for Places in the Heart, delivering the famous line, "You like me." By the end of her career, she had 2 Best Actress Oscars and 3 Emmys. Burt Reynolds, for all his fame, earned exactly 1 Oscar nomination in his life, for Boogie Nights in 1998, and didn't win. Their relationship lasted around 5 years before she ended it in 1982. After that, she barely spoke to him again for the next 30 years. They'd made 4 films together, and on screen they looked like one of the great romantic pairs of their era. But once she walked away in real life, she kept the distance total, on purpose, for 3 decades, even as he spent those same years publicly calling her the love of his life in interview after interview. She never answered with warmth, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity, because even a gentle response risked reopening something she'd worked hard to close for good. Here's the detail that gives the whole story its real weight. Field spent 7 years writing in pieces, mostly believing it would never actually be published. That means it wasn't written as an attack. It was private work, her way of understanding her own life. Then the timing turned brutal. The book came out on September 18, 2018. Burt Reynolds had died of a heart attack just 12 days earlier, on September 6th, at age 82. Her reaction wasn't victory. She said she was glad he'd never read it, that it would have hurt him, that she was relieved he'd never have to defend himself or lash out over it. That's not the mindset of someone settling a score. She was also fair to what had actually existed between them, describing the relationship as confusing and complicated, not without loving and caring, but deeply hurtful to her at the same time. When people brought up his repeated claims that she was the love of his life, she said she was always flattered by it, then added simply that he was a complicated man. In the end, Burt Reynolds and Sally Field lived through the same 5 years and walked away with 2 completely different stories. In his version, she was the perfect woman he lost, the permanent regret of his life, someone he mourned publicly for decades. In her version, he was controlling, jealous, and struggling with drugs, a man who threw a script at her, dismissed her biggest career triumphs, and stirred up the exact emotional wounds from her childhood that she'd spent years trying to heal. But here's the quiet detail that reveals whose account carries more weight. Her version never denies that real feeling existed between them. She said it wasn't without loving and caring. His version, on the other hand, only works if her entire experience disappears. The jealousy, the control, the thrown script, the empty seat at the Oscars. Her story leaves room for his feelings. His story leaves no room for her pain, and Field herself put the sharpest point on it. In his final years, when Reynolds kept insisting she'd meant more to him than he'd realized, she said she believed he mainly wanted what he couldn't have, that even his devotion carried the shape of appetite, longing for something that had simply moved out of his reach.